with.
Thank you. We're getting recorded. Goodness.
Oh, and if you have trouble listening here online, just feel free to drop a message. We'll be watching the chat as well.
Getting all kinds of messages coming up here. All right. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We're going to talk tonight about scaling, and we're going to talk not just about my experience, but I know for a fact that there are many people in this room who've had experience with scaling. So expect to participate just a little bit, because I think we can all learn from each other. I'm going to need some help here with my Zoom. Seeing now? Gary, you want to come and help me for a sec?
Gary, can you help with the Zoom? Oh, there you go.
You got it. You got it. Thanks it up. We're going to have some fun with words tonight. I think words matter. We're going to talk about words and a little bit of grammar. We will have some fun with it. But I think we should start by talking about what does this word scaling mean? And actually, I'd like to hear a little bit from you. What do you think scaling means? How do you use it in your organizations?
Expanding your operations on south, north and south, both like horizontally and vertically expanding.
Expanding your operations north, south, east, west. Okay, cool. Anyone else?
Changing in size, a system.
Good. Okay. Sometimes you think about scaling as climbing up and over something, right? Something high and steep. And sometimes we think about, what about taking the bony scales off to protect a fish's skin? Sometimes we think about those deposits that build up, flaky deposits that build up to cover things like steel. Now, I think there's a treasure trove of metaphors in all three of these definitions that you've probably experienced in your organization. When we think about reducing things, we think about taking the hard stuff off. We think about, oh, is stuff building up that's preventing us from being effective? But I think we're actually talking about something else, and I think Andrew's alluded to it a little bit here. It's really about reducing or increasing something according to a particular scale. So what do I mean by the scale? Well, the scale represents the axes or the elements, the things that we care about, that we want to maintain the proportionality of when we're shrinking or growing something, so that we don't get something that's distorted when we go through that process. We all know what happens when you don't click that little box that says maintain aspect ratio. And then you try and grow something and then you get this, right? I think we should be talking and focusing on this concept in scaling. The concept that we're really trying to maintain.
Yeah, we've got a lot of noise in the back.
Okay. That better? Can you hear me now?
A little bit higher.
How about that? So yes, about what do we want to maintain? What elements of our organization, what elements of what we're trying to accomplish do we want to maintain, whether we're growing something or whether we're shrinking something? But I would also maintain that this is also a perilous journey against the force of gravity. So I do like the climbing. So let's turn a little bit to grammar for a minute. When we think about scaling, tense matters. Scaling is present tense, means, you know, this is an ongoing thing. That's quite different from scaled. which actually means, well, we solved the problem, haven't we? We finished, right? These are two very, very, very different ways to think about this problem of scaling. We'll come back to that. And then, of course, there's this thing we call descaling, right? Who here has heard of descaling? Yeah. So really what descaling is, the notion of descaling that most people have, is that we're actually trying to remove things from, in this case, our organization. We're trying to make things simpler. We're trying to reduce some complexity. We're trying to make it less difficult, right? Now, if Erkan were here, I would be able to talk to him about his espresso machine. Because again, descaling is actually about taking away the things that build up in your organization that get in the way of being an effective organization. Right? So I'm going to talk about scaling and descaling as the same thing from the perspective of it's all about, are we shrinking, are we growing, and are we actually thinking about what we want to maintain, what's important to us when we go through that change. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about terms for tonight, I want to talk a little bit about where does this often go wrong? And to do that, I am going to ask you, this works from menti.com. Can you please tell us a couple of words, few words, if you had some experience with scaling agility and you haven't gotten the impact that you hoped to get? Curious if you could express in a few words, what did you find difficult? What have you found difficult? So I'll just give you a minute or two to add your thoughts to that. Lack of understanding, consistency, getting leadership buy-in, safe, hierarchy, top down, participation for some groups, communication, getting everyone on the same page, alignment, teams believing they don't need whatever you're scaling, manageability. Good. I mean, not good. But yes, as you can see, there's a lot of common things here. I want to tell you a little bit. I have a similar experience to all of you. Right? I see three main sort of patterns over the last 2 decades that I've experienced. One of them is we adopt this thing, whatever it is. You know what? We need to scale. We adopt it, but we really only adopt it in name only. We change the names of some of our roles. We change the names of some of our meetings. But actually, nothing else really changes. We stay with the original way of work. I've seen that a lot. The second thing that I see quite a bit is we take the approach of adopting something, a framework maybe of some kind, and we focus solely on the process. Focus on following the framework. We focus on, are we doing it right? Okay. And I think what ends up happening here is that we end up focusing on trying to keep the wrong things proportional when we scale. We think about, well, we need to keep our same organizational structure. We need to keep the same team structure. We need to keep this thing about individual utility over delivering value the same because we care about utility. And so we tend to focus on some old school, in my mind, things to keep the same while we go through this process. Very often, we end up simply scaling dysfunction. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, well, we have a team, but on their own, they're not actually functioning very. Then we jump in and we say, you know what? We should scale that. We should get big at that. It's like, well, all the things that you are finding dysfunctional now are only going to get more impactful as you scale it. And so a couple of examples here. Maybe you've got multiple people on multiple teams. Maybe you never have a retrospective. You don't take the time to inspect and adapt. If you take those things and then try to scale it, you're bound to have some problems, because it's very difficult, as you all know. It takes a lot of discipline to do what we do well. If you try to scale those things without getting really good at doing it at a small level, you're going to run into trouble. Thing is, I think that the difficulty with trying to adopt or install a broad framework, and there's lots of them, we'll talk about in a minute. Safe, less, discipline, whatever it is. The thing is that most of the time, these things are predefined, past tense, right? We've solved the problem for you. And the other part is that most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, they're quite static, which means there isn't really a way for you to think about how are we going to evolve into this and past it. And so that's, to me, some of the main difficulties with trying to just install or adopt something without your context. That's what we're going to end up really talking about here. Okay. Of course, when we're scaling, we are borrowing principles, right, and practices from all of those that have gone before us, right? The trouble is that so often the context of those who've gone before us is either lost in translation or it was never there in the first place, right? Why does this matter? And for me, it matters is because I like to think of scaling. Scaling is not a problem to be solved. Scaling is a solution to a business problem. And I think that is super important for us to recognize. Like, I feel like as a coach helping an organization, it's our job to regularly refactor the business problem and then help an organization think about what are the appropriate solutions to solving that problem. Of course, some of them it involves these things that we think about called scaling. But in order to do all that, we have to have an understanding of our current state and what we want to change. What do we want more of? What do we want less of? What are our current constraints and what are the cost of those constraints? Those are the real problems that we need to start thinking about rather than starting with, we need to scale. We really need to have a very compelling understanding of why do we think we need to scale. Now, for me, there's two main classes, I would call these classes of business problems that most people boil scaling down to the solution for. One is too much complexity. What do I mean by that? I mean, we're working on things that involve so many different skills that we either have to have a real high cognitive overload for the people on our team, or we have to have so many people on our team that it becomes unwieldy. Now we have a 20-person team because we need all those skills, okay? And one of the things that people think about for scaling is, let's actually figure out a way to divide the cognitive overload in a way that will then help us move forward. So that's sort of one class. And I'm trying to represent it here by, we have this little backlog, we've got customers that are, maybe we have competing priorities, but we got all these people on the team because we need all these specialists. How can we, approach them? That's one sort of class of. The second class of problems is really around, well, we don't have enough capacity. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, you know what? We have a well-functioning team. We're working through a backlog, prioritize, fantastic. But there's so much value we're leaving on the table. We'd love to have more. So how can we get more capacity and flow on this product or, for our business? So to me, I'm sure there are other reasons to scale, but a lot of them boil down to cognitive overload. You're trying to reduce that, or you're trying to increase capacity and flow, something that's already working quite well, right? And of course, the trick is, how do we maintain the business benefits of the value that we get from agility on a single team and get that from multiple teams, right? On multiple team endeavors. Yeah, it's worse, right? Because maybe you have an understanding of what that rough business problem is. The real trick here is, what's your context for these business problems, right? Like, how do you currently define success? That matters, right? What do you want more of? What business problems are you trying to solve? What are your team and organizational structures and constraints? What skills does your organization have? What values and principles are important to your organization? And tons more, right? But this starts to form your context for those business problems. And I think the thing that we often miss is, of course, all of those things are changing. Those aren't static. And so your context is changing, right? And so we return back to this concept of scaling versus scaled, right? If your context is changing, then this is an ongoing endeavor, right? Whether your definition of success changes, the skills in your organizations change, how you structure the organization changes, it's an ongoing effort. You're never done. And maybe that's scary, but it's okay. I'm going to loop back to a talk that Lucas Tetro gave back in November in this room. And I think it's a really great example. He was talking and posed the question of, is Amazon AWS Agile? I watched this video and a couple of things really stood out to me. He had this slide here and he talked about, for instance, he works in an environment where we have these two pizza teams. And these two pizza teams have full ownership of what they produce, from napkin to production and support. Do your teams have that? His teams, they didn't seem to care much about code duplication. I'm not saying they didn't care at all, but it wasn't an actual primary factor. They didn't mind, if this team and this team actually had duplicate code bases. It wasn't the end of the world for them. Does your organization care about that? I'm not here to argue one way or the other whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying I'm setting up some context here, right? They managed to have no handoffs and have a high level of independence because they rely solely on API contracts. Do your teams? And of course, if the answer is no, then please don't try and do what it is they're doing at AWS. Okay? They're doing a great job. Is AWS Agile? You're damn right they are. Right? But they're doing it their way. And he said that, like we grow our own. And the reason we grow our own is because we recognize we have our own context. Right? And the stuff that other people are doing matters way less to us. We know what our context is. So we're going to borrow from people who've come before us and use it in our context. I think the other classic example of this is the so-called Spotify model, right? When Henrik put this post out in 2012, people really loved what they saw. The thing is, they didn't really look at that thing that's circled in the orange down there. It's right there in the post. It's great that they're organized this way. I mean, tribes and chapters and squads and super cool. But the thing that most people didn't see is that little circled disclaimer, which says, this is a snapshot in time. We are moving so fast. By the time you read this, we've probably moved on. because our context has changed, right? They're in a different place in their agile journey, likely, than you are. They have a different business context than you. What makes you think that you can take what they're doing, plonk it into your organization, and have it work the way it was successful for them at that very specific point in time? One of the things that I think is interesting here is put this paper out, but of course it can't be completely transparent about all the different supports that may have been in place to help make that happen. But you have no idea about it. We see these pictures and we go, this is an awesome way to organize ourselves. But we actually don't necessarily understand the full context of why it worked for them at that particular time. Okay? This is the danger of taking anything, a framework, model like this, and saying, yahoo, let's emulate that. Unless you really, really understand that your context is close enough that this should work for you, and why. So this is sort of a last minute addition because the State of Agile report came out like last week or 10 days ago or something. It is the 17th edition of it. And whatever you think about, this is just one data point in the industry. It's certainly not the be all and end all. I might take some of these numbers with a grain of salt, but I think that there are some interesting indicators here around scaling. Back in 2022, like everyone knows, SAFE is the framework of choice for, and in this case, like more than half of people who were answering the survey were like, well, we implement SAFE. In 2023, you'll see that number has been cut in half to 26%. I don't know if that's true or not, but what I do know is down here at the bottom right-hand corner, they introduced something that says, we don't follow a mandated model, 22%. Or we created our own enterprise agile framework, 12%. So it doesn't really matter what the state of those numbers is. What matters is there's obviously a significant portion of people who have started to recognize that the stuff we've been trying actually doesn't work in our context. We've got to make modifications. We've got to figure out what works for us and how we want to evolve. So I just put this up here. I just grabbed this off of LinkedIn simply to point out that it's like, yeah, it feels like lots of people are starting to see this. So, what to do? I'm suggesting here, and this is not, I'm not making this myself at all. This is lots of people think this way, that we take this principle-led but pattern-based approach to our scaling efforts, right? That we rely on our own organization's cultural values and principles alongside well understood agile and scaling principles and guide our own decision-making about what makes sense for us in our context, right? And I think, as we're going to see in a minute, if you're not familiar with patterns, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. And I hope what you're getting from this is your context, your context, your context. What matters here is not agile. It's not scaling. This is all about success. This is all about we do all of these things, right, to solve business problems. And that is all about the context that we're in at our own individual organizations. So what do we mean by the word, what I mean by the word pattern? Back in 1977, this fellow, Christopher Alexander, and his colleagues who are architects have been doing a bunch of work around constructing buildings and towns of all types, and created this book, which essentially outlines all the numerous common problems in architecture that needed to be solved in the context of their usage. And he describes the term pattern this way. Essentially, it describes a common problem that happens over and over again. It then describes a core of the solution to that problem. And that the core solution is described in a way that you could instantiate it over and over and over and over again and never do it the same way twice. Because your context is different. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about patterns. It's very important that we recognize that a pattern is both a description of a common problem as well as a description of the core solution, that when you go to instantiate that core solution, it may never be the same twice. Okay? I think that's the same thing that we are doing when we're scaling. I see a myriad of patterns that each represent common problems across our businesses, right? And that we think about the potential core solutions. And those are the core solutions that need to be instantiated in our. Patterns come from anywhere. Like I've got, I don't know, 9, 10 framework things here: team topology, safe, less, untrace, fast, Scrum Practice, Agile, Scrum.org, Scrum at Scale. There's lots of sources for patterns. And all of these kinds of frameworks, or however you want to describe them, contain patterns that are common amongst them, right? That there's common business problems, there's core solutions. So I think what's important is that you recognize that everything inside these frameworks is not a pattern. Sometimes there's anti-patterns, in my opinion. Sometimes there's quote unquote best practices without context. Sometimes there's experiments. And so I think we need to get good at trying to understand where are the patterns and then how do they apply to our particular context. I want to point out here that the other thing about these frameworks, with the exception maybe of one or two, like Disciplined Agile, for the most part, they're pretty static. Disciplined Agile does, for instance, does a service of recognizing that there's an evolution to your scaling. You are going to be evolved. Most of them are fairly static. Here's how you need to set yourself up for success. But they don't have your context. Okay. So what we're going to do here, row 1 and 3 are going to rotate their chairs so that they're facing rows 2 and 4. I'm going to give you an example of a scaling pattern. Okay, and here it is. I'm calling it for now the multi-team prioritization pattern. The problem here is, how do we make sure we have multiple teams working on a release? How do we make sure that all our teams are working on the right stuff for our upcoming release? Is this a familiar problem to you? I see nodding heads. Yes, this is a common problem. How do we make sure? The core solution to this, and I have described it as simply as I can, is what I would call multi-team release planning. Who here has been involved in some form of multi-team release planning? Right. Potentially, you could use PI planning, product increment planning, for instance. Potentially big room planning. Maybe you could use joint refinement, if any of you have done that. Maybe you use a scrums. Maybe you have a team of POs, product owners. The key here is that there's many other things that you could do. Depending on your context, you could choose to instantiate this multi-team release planning in a different way. So I want you just to think here about these 3 questions. I've written here some situational context impacting how you might implement an appropriate solution in your organization. What are your constraints? What do you want to maintain the proportionality of? What might be just enough right now? Okay, well, I want you to think about what factors in your organization might impact how you approached this multi-team release. I just want you to share some thoughts. If you've never been involved in this, just listen, it's totally cool. But some of you have done this before. Some of you definitely understand the different contextual things that are going on. So I'm gonna give you like 8 minutes. Turn your chairs around and please try and share some thoughts about what is the context of your organization that might make you or has made you in the past choose a particular way of doing multi-team release.
We don't work in software.
How are those groups coming there, Thor?
Rooms are ready to go.
Oh, 8 minutes, please.
I know.
Okay, Daniel, go ahead. Let's do it.
The rooms are open. Everyone, feel free to join those breakout rooms.
Outside of product.
Everybody online, please, yeah, go ahead and join those rooms.
Operations, that entirety of the program. Through like budget.
We could use somebody else in room 3 and room 2.
And then in my world, a lot of project execution, so multi-year, $100 million projects going from drawings to something physical.
And if you don't want to go to a room, that's fine.
Agile.
Yeah, but it's not a things that we or let's say you got chain of dependencies.
That's why applying it's helped us because it's
Different apps.
It's a good
collaboration, so that there was that common understanding.
Okay.
Much time to which just so we've also modern applications like part maybe some random integration. You might realize that work otherwise we're still bouncing around. But it's like I was at expertise the room was definitely how much time see how we're doing and my
It becomes challenging, especially when you have queries within single table, not in line with all systems. Say,
This
you need
is
to build a
make
something
update or like
right now.
broadcasting. How this is.
There's been a request and you have like 5 teams that on you to do
Also
this.
shows Instagram
So
that this
what do you decide?
information is submitted is this
Either back
because it's
that or
really difficult. Small teams
you
to
feel
reach
and teams they need
each
to.
of them. Also, they want
But
the
your time is main constraint.
consolidated dashboard. So that's what they.
So it sounds like communication.
Yeah, that's the core part. Yeah. Timing, it was a really start to have, a more,
Okay, so what's
alert, or I would say what is.
White up.
This part of it.
This one. You promised to deliver, for example, for another week.
And I think what becomes important is the ability to measure the value on the biggest inconsistent way. So it's not like today you have a group of teams or team reps, they decide on one priority list based on
Like maintaining communication, maintaining.
Whatever the tool you can use.
they are doing it again, like a different result. That doesn't make much sense. Yeah. That's the answer for the second question.
Come on.
Also, I want to add.
You're probably intermediate.
Last one.
Yeah, the same goal. Organization.
How common is the reserve some time potential?
That thing drop on the ground.
You're around 100% lucky that you're
So the many cases.
it's going sideways now.
Is the timeline.
So frame
You
of
can extend it.
Certain
Certain activities which belongs to the cannot be extended.
Might be
They are
just
crucial.
like
A real drop dead date.
Instrument or get
So you could drop some balls, but not.
Creating priority. Priority or certain baseline. It's important.
Yeah, it sounds like a common agreement on what is potentially super inside of which balls are glass balls. Because I might have a different idea of what's important to you.
Yeah.
Close the rooms in for Dan, close the rooms in a minute or so.
Yeah. Publicly changed.
Make it by a committee, basically.
Oh. The service delivery head. If a delivery.
Earlier was we had 7 teams on a project. And we were one team.
Whoever were like more having the major step, 16 would be. They decided what all are the activities are most crucial.
I think they still leave.
How did, as an example, the principal architect stay informed enough to be able to make those decisions? Like, how do you get all that information that way?
Yeah. Provide like
They'll go ask for help and if it will.
what are the backgrounds?
Yeah, it might be in the beginning. They're not.
That's how.
Somebody.
What might be. Are we problem?
Say, this is the direction we're gonna go.
Leveraging the different subject matter leaders' experience.
That's what we put time. Other people. That's one thing we try to work well. And why you do very well informed.
Oh, crazy.
So, I mean, coming back, like, well, what should we work on next? Right, well, let's leave our some problem.
What are we starting?
You are on. Probably you have to.
But then he gets consensus.
Yeah, and it's. They don't cross down. program that's specialized in reserve capacity helps to address emergencies.
You find that there was like, in that case, people had sort of had projects or passion projects with that driving it, but then understanding what was wanted, or it was just.
Yeah.
I'm glad it was figured out the speed.
It's their world.
Yeah.
And you forget your roots.
And also. The driver would be. Money. Maybe more production. Often in conflict with each other. Like, so you this is.
All right, everyone is coming back from the rooms. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully you got a chance to hear some ideas. Can we get, I'd like to hear 2 thoughts from the online crew. Anyone want to unmute themselves and briefly tell us what you talked about? What one constraint or what thing were you thinking of when you were like, oh, here's what is going to be difficult for us about multi team release plan. Anyone?
Sure, I'll go. One of the big constraints personally experienced is it's been around understanding current state and the actual problem. So the framework was trying to solve a problem that the framework couldn't actually solve. So the context was completely overlooked.
Anyone else online want to tell us a little bit about some factors in your organization that might sway which way you try to do multi-team release plan? Okay, how about here in the room? I heard a couple of really good ones. Vlad.
Dysfunctional group, everybody had their own agenda. They were not.
Everybody has their own agenda. Okay. That's a good one. Anyone else? I would really want to point out the one you mentioned. Trust. A lot of this stuff takes trust. You don't have it, it ain't gonna work. Not very well. Right? So that's another good example. You know, I put some more examples up here, like, are you talking about feature teams or component teams or other kinds of teams? That might have an impact on how you try to do this release, multi-team release planning. What about if you have one PO? I think there was a group you were talking about, well, we only have one PO, and wow, is that a problem? Maybe it's a problem, but it might be a problem for how you're trying to instantiate multi-team release planning. Like, it matters whether you've got multiple POs or a single PO. And what about just general familiarity with the problem space and the domain space? If you've got a bunch of beginners in either the domain or the technology, that might be different than if you've got people who've been working together for a long time. So thanks for that. I just wanted you to be able to share some of the different factors that are going on in your organizations. I just wanted to give you an example of, we all have this problem. We all know that roughly the core solution is we should get multiple teams to talk, but it matters what their context is and how you might instantiate that solution. Okay, we're going to turn our attention now to this concept of scaffolding, because together, patterns and scaffolding are how I think is a really good place to start to figure out how to start solving your business problems with scaling. Now, what is scaffolding? Well, this picture is actually from the Museum of the Future in Dubai. I think we're all relatively familiar with what scaffolding is, but I think the thing that's important about it is it's temporary, right? What does it do? It provides a safe place for us to do our work while we're transitioning to a different state. Right? I love this quote from Dave Snowden. Some of you might know him from his work with Kinevin. You know, rather than trying to design organizations, you know, on their own, we should be designing the scaffolding around them, making interventions around that scaffolding and letting the organizational structure emerge. I think that's a pretty interesting approach to this. So scaffolds are temporary processes, temporary roles, temporary structures that allow a core pattern solution to be more contextually effective. I'll give you an example in a second here. The key is that it's helping you transition to something, to an evolution. A really classic example that I'm sure lots of you would be this thing we call planning poker. I'm sure most of you have heard of this thing we call planning poker, right? What is it? It's this thing we do on a recurrent basis that allows a team to talk about how big something is, relatively speaking. And allows us to have conversations around the differences in our thoughts about how big something is, right? And that's actually a really good way to help a new team, a team that's new to a problem domain, a team that's new to technology stack, how to help them figure out how to get some experience and understand how to work together and understand that domain. But most teams that use it, if they stay together for any period of time, eventually, like, we don't need to do this anymore. That was awesome when we were trying to figure stuff out. Now we've got a lot more experience in the problem domain with each other, in the tech stack, all that kind of stuff. We don't actually have to have that conversation anymore. There's an example of a scaffold. Okay. Another scaffolding example might be, have you ever gone into a iteration plan and tasked everything out? I'm going to work on this thing and we're going to have people write out all the tasks. That might be, again, super useful for people who've never worked together or for people who don't necessarily understand the problem of the tech stack. But eventually it's like, actually, we don't need to do that anymore. But it does help you understand, it does further your ability to solve the business problems that it does. And of course, the last good example is hire an agile coach. That's a scaffold. It should be anyway. It should be temporary. It should be about, we can help you hone some skills internally so you don't need an agile coach anymore because you have those skills inside the organization. So we're going to come back to the world of words again here. And, you know, in the world of translation of the written word, there really is this spectrum of contextual fidelity. And it goes all the way from, you know, the left, word for word, literal translation, to something in the middle, what we call communicative and semantic. And what do we mean by that? Effectively, it means that, you know, we are translating the contextual meaning of the words rather than the words just in isolation. And then on the far right side, where we have high contextual fidelity, we have, this is normal for things in the world of arts, like plays and operas, where what we're trying to do is we're trying to preserve the themes, the characters, the plots, but actually the cultural differences get translated to the target audience. So what I think is important here is that we, when we're trying to help organizations scale, is that we've got to start taking some of the common patterns that are out there that are written in the source language, the framework of choice, and start thinking about contextually, how can we translate that to our culture, to our context, to our constraints? So that's a skill. Okay, it doesn't come overnight. But I think that's where we could and should be focusing. is figuring out how to translate those things that are out there that people have gone before us, try to understand their original context and how does it apply to our context. That's how we're going to be successful using those common patterns. I think I'll finish up here. It's really when we start to examine in this appropriate context for all of these scaling patterns that we could use, that you'll start to really, really inspect and pay attention to what are those things that you want to keep the proportionality of as we grow or shrink. Now, for me, these are the 4 things I want to keep proportional. I want the connection to each other and the work to stay proportional. I want the clarity on what's valuable to stay proportional. I want the collaboration towards common goals, right? I want continuous flow value. That's me. It's not you, right? It's not your context. You've got to get an understanding of what matters in your organization right now, knowing it might change. This is what matters to me as a coach, right? In this world. And really the last thing here is successful scaling involves introducing and sustaining change in your context, right? When we talked about this, scaling versus scale, and I got to give Nigel credit for this. He really, Nigel Baker seemed to coin this. If we are constantly changing, that's likely a pretty complex endeavor. And what do we know is a useful way to address complexity, complex problems? Taking an iterative and incremental approach. Rather than a predefined or context-free approach. It's what we need to do is understand the business problems that we're trying to solve, create experiments with patterns and scaffolding, inspect and adapt. Are we getting more of what we want to get more of? Are we getting less of what we want to get less? Evolve, rather than just install something static. I'm gonna use this opportunity to plug Dave Sherrick out in Vancouver. I think today he finished his first class of the Certified Agile Scaling Skills. This is a 2-day course that I was involved in creating the learning objectives for that are all about patterns and stuff. Taking this approach to inside your organization, evolving how you scale your teams. When I'm not thinking about scaling, I'm thinking about fly fishing in the summer. If you want to get in touch with me after, you can get in touch with me any of these different ways. I really like this quote here, especially because I like fly fishing. But I have to tell you, it's a translation from Greek to Roman to English. So the context may have been lost. Thank you. Questions? Including the people online. It's o'clock. Anyone, any?
I have a question for you, Simon, perhaps more, well, can you the idea of don't install, evolve. Can you talk more about that?
Don't install, evolve. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think the trap here is that the past tense of if you just do this, you'll find success. I think that is a trap. it's the key to this, or it's the core message here, which is if someone has solved the problem for you, they're doing it without understanding your context. They might think they understand your context, but I think as we've kind of discussed here, there's all kinds of context that goes into successfully solving some of these problems. And when you install something and make a decision, we are going to follow this framework. I'm not saying it's not, you can't do that. I'm not saying it can't be successful. What I'm saying is that there's a massive danger that without addressing how contextually that framework was set up and whether it makes sense in your world, if you don't take those things into account, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. Meaning, and by trouble, what I really mean is we don't understand why this isn't getting what we wanted out of it in the first place. That's the kind of trouble I'm talking about, right? Because I know people invest a lot of time, we all invest a lot of time and energy and money in trying to figure out how to solve these business problems, right? And so if you install a framework, it's contextless, you're going to end up likely in a situation where you're wondering to yourself, well, we're doing this thing, but it's not actually having the outcomes that we hoped it would have. Does that help, Thor?
Yes, that was very eloquent. Much appreciated.
Has anyone here worked in an organization where they made their own, grew their own framework? Why do you think people are perhaps averse to growing their own?
Probably just the fear of getting it wrong, because theoretically someone's already solved the problem, so why would you deviate to the risk?
Nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. In my opinion. And by the way, it does take a lot of skill and experience to be able to work through that whole process of trying to understand, here's a pattern, it's reasonable to me. What do we need to do to make it applicable to our context? That takes absolutely skill and experience to do, right? I think that often we are sold that if you just follow the recipe, none of that matters. I disagree with that. I've seen it go south very, very often.
Context definitely matters. Thoughts on influencing things to change the context, right? Like if you see, hey, the way things are set up, I don't really see how any pattern I know is going to work. So, any thoughts on how you can influence the work?
This is the golden question, isn't it? If you really find yourself in a situation where you don't see how any of these things can be successful, that's when I think you need to start having those very difficult conversations, which are, there's nothing out there that's going to help us because we care about the following things, and none of those things match what we say we want, which is, why are we doing this agile thing again? The next best question is, what's the smallest thing we could do? What's the next smallest thing we could do to take us a little bit further? We're not talking about massive changes here. Well, actually, sometimes this is the problem with just quote unquote adopting a framework, because it actually does involve often a massive change. It causes all kinds of disruption with good intention, right? It's an awful lot of money, time, and effort to then find out, oh, it's not quite doing what we want it to do. When you're in a situation where you identify there's a disconnect between, well, actually the organization cares actually more about individual utility than flow through teams. That's a huge thing that we have to get past. What's the next best thing we can do to figure out how can we get better at the flow on these teams? Well, maybe the next best thing is instead of allowing people to work on 4 teams, they can only work on 2. I know it's a very small example, but I've literally done that in an organization where they're so addicted to, we got to have everyone 100% allocated time, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you're missing the point. I don't care if people are only 80% or less. What matters is what's the team doing, not what the individuals. And so, yeah, it's not awesome to have, people on 4 different teams. Is that ever going to change to one team tomorrow? No, but you might be able to say, well, how about only 3 or only 2? And let's see if that changes anything. Let's measure whether that actually has an impact on our ability to flow work through the organization. Anything else?
Just hand up there for a second.
Or
I did. Actually, there's a question in the chat that I think would be worth looking at.
since context is built around individual, that one?
Yes.
Yes, 100%. Wouldn't it be reasonable, if not expected, to have agile practices vary across an organization, especially as that organization grows larger? Now, Michelle, is that Michelle Kawa?
You found me.
Michelle, yes. So I very much agree with this statement that you have made here. Unfortunately, there are, I don't know, 70% of the organizations I've worked with, they don't agree with that statement. As we grow bigger, some organizations, lots of organizations, think the way to go is consistency. Everybody does the same thing. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure everybody does the same thing. Right? You'll notice the AWS guy, Lucas, they don't do that. They have some very, some pillars, I would say, that are like, well, we all roughly adhere to these pillars. But actually, you got your own team. You're responsible from napkin to production. You figure it out. You do it. We don't care if you duplicate code. We don't care if this, how you do it. They're not looking for consistency in how those people do the work. They may be looking for consistency in what are the touch points between those teams. That's what they care about. So does that help with, I'm not even sure it was a question. It was more of a statement, it seems like, Michelle.
I think to maybe add on a little bit of that from my own experience there as a software developer, I really reflect upon the idea of sub-optimization, right? Like if you try to homogenize all of your services and all your capabilities so that everything is equal across your entire domain, it's going to cost you a bloody fortune.
That's right.
Right. So like what you really need to do is find the Goldilocks zone of balancing between what you're going to refactor now and what you can live with until later. Right. So like there's always a trade-off there. There's never a state of perfection. That state of perfection is like just for like a moment in time. Like this last delivery where we just got us there and it was perfect. But that very next moment, it's already passed. Right. So like you got to always, navigate that balancing point between refactoring your organizational processes just in the same way that you do in your technical processes.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thor's got his hand up.
Oh, not again.
I know, right? I want to follow up on both Daniel and Michelle's comment, and I'm really curious. The temptation for the C-suite managers, etc., the organization to measure standardized processes is really intense, right? Because the standardization, if everyone's doing the same thing, oh my gosh, the metrics, right? It's like a drug for them. And I guess in your own experience, what's one of the ways that you use to combat that notion? Because this is so apt, the variation across teams, the ability to choose your own way, self-organize, etc., to be agile, but that pressure from above to standardize. Your experience in combating that, a narrative, I guess, against that. What's worked for you?
Well, it won't surprise you to hear that I think lots of organizations end up measuring the wrong things to start with, right? We started this whole thing by saying, if you're scaling to scale, you are doing it wrong, right? You better be scaling because there's a valuable business outcome that you're going to be seeing on a regular basis, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So measure that. The rest of it is helpful. And it might help us, point us in a particular direction. But if we're not actually measuring the outcome, the reason that we're doing all of this, then we really are missing the boat. I don't care that you adhere to all the different things in this framework. Actually, all I care about is what did we get for it? What capabilities did that give us? What adaptability did that give us? Whatever's, again, it depends what's important to your organization, right? And there are definitely organizations that standardization is the most important thing to them. That is their culture, and that's what matters. And if that's the case, well, that's the limitation around how you're going to scale stuff. I guess you're just all going to be following the same thing because we care less about the outcomes and more about the standardization. Okay, I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. I'm just saying we need to be okay to have that conversation and be okay with the answer. Daniel.
The only thing I would just maybe add to some of that is I have found in my own experience, one of the great homogenizers for cross-functional, especially, is dollar bills, right? Some way, shape, or form, you can roll it back into dollar bills, and that can show you, something. But when you consider the overall value pyramid, it also points to how immature that the organizational understanding of what they're after is. Right? Because money is just a means to those greater purposes and capabilities that they're truly after, right? Like Apple will pay anything to make sure that you're not wearing a Google Watch. They want you in their ecosystem 1000%, right? So like they don't care what it costs, but they also still can use the money measure to see if they're progressing in the right direction. So it's good for cardinality and directionality, like as a compass, but it's not great for orientation in terms of like a star map. It won't tell you exactly where you're at.
Thanks. Good over time. Yeah. Anything else? Thank you all. It's very fun.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon.
Dan, can you flash up the QR code? Take over sharing. There we go. So if you wouldn't mind grabbing the QR code, it's just a survey. Your feedback helps us help you as our community. So thank you again, Simon. Greatly appreciated. Thank you everybody for coming out. Glad you can make it and engage and enjoy this time together. Our next session is March 14th. It's with Alan Jealous. Is that his last name? Yeah. You'd be jealous of everybody else if you weren't here to hear Alan. And it is, interestingly enough, a good dovetail of learn the culture first and then go agile. So understanding the space that you're going into before you go and change that space. So please grab the QR code on the screen over there. Give us your feedback. Again, thank you for coming out, and we hope to see you on March 14th.